I was standing at the pharmacy counter on a Thursday afternoon, waiting for my monthly refill, when the young woman behind the register, not the usual girl, someone new, filling in, handed me my bag, then suddenly reached across the counter and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was firm, urgent, entirely out of proportion to the moment. "Sir," she said quietly, glancing toward the back of the store before she spoke again. "The new capsule they added last month, the small blue one. Don't take it tonight. Please, just don't." Then she let go, straightened up, and called out, "Next in line," to the woman behind me, as though nothing had happened at all. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long time afterward, turning that orange bottle over in my hands, reading a label I'd read 100 times without ever really seeing it. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't fully understand for another 3 weeks, was that my daughter-in-law, a woman I'd trusted enough to let manage my medical paperwork for 2 years, had quietly rewritten the story of my health into something that was never true, for reasons that had nothing to do with keeping me well. My name is Frank Whitaker. I'm 73 years old, and this is the story of the year I found out my own chart had been turned into a weapon. I spent 31 years teaching high school physics in a small town in central Pennsylvania, the kind of career that doesn't make you rich, but leaves you with a stubborn habit of wanting things to add up. My wife, Doreen, passed 6 years ago. A stroke, sudden, the kind that doesn't give you time to prepare no matter how much you think you have. After she was gone, I stayed in the house we'd raised our son in, mostly because leaving it felt like erasing the last 22 years we'd spent inside it together. My son, Danny, is 41. He married Renee about 8 years ago, and for the first several years, I liked her a great deal. She's organized, capable, the kind of person who remembers appointments and follow-up calls better than I ever could. She worked as an office manager for a regional home health agency, the kind of company that sends nurses and aides into elderly people's homes. And when my blood pressure started climbing about 3 years ago, followed a year later by a mild cardiac scare that put 2 stents in my chest, Renee offered to help manage my medical paperwork. Appointment scheduling, prescription refills, insurance correspondence, the endless administrative maze that comes with being an aging man with a growing list of specialists. I said yes, gratefully. I'd never been good at that kind of organization. Doreen had always handled it when she was alive, and Renee seemed like exactly the right person for the job. Professional, thorough, plugged into the healthcare system in a way I wasn't. I signed a form at my primary doctor's office, authorizing her as an approved contact who could speak to my providers and pick up my prescriptions on my behalf. I want to be honest, I don't think I read that form as closely as I should have. I trusted her, the same uncomplicated way you trust family, until something forces you to look closer. Looking back now, I can trace a pattern that started small enough to dismiss and grew, over about 18 months, into something I should have questioned far sooner. It began with my energy. About a year and a half ago, I started feeling tired in a way that didn't match how I felt about my actual health. Foggy in the mornings, unsteady on my feet by early afternoon, occasionally confused about small things like where I'd set my keys, or whether I'd already taken a particular pill. My doctor, a good but overworked man named Dr. Aldous who saw dozens of patients a day, attributed it to normal aging, complicated by my cardiac history, adjusted a dosage here and there, and moved on to the next patient. I didn't push back because I didn't have a reason to. Renee, present at several of those appointments, nodded along thoughtfully, occasionally adding small details about my recent episodes that I didn't fully recognize as my own experience, but didn't think to correct in the moment, because who corrects their daughter-in-law in front of a doctor over something that small? Around the same time, Renee began gently raising the subject of getting ahead of things, suggesting, with increasing frequency, that given my cognitive fog and physical unsteadiness, it might eventually make sense to consider more structured living arrangements, an assisted care facility, something with staff on hand around the clock. I resisted, the way I imagine most people my age resist that particular conversation. But I noticed the suggestions kept returning, always framed gently, always framed gently, always framed gently. What I didn't notice, because I had no reason to look for it, was that every one of those symptoms, the fog, the unsteadiness, the small, confused moments, tracked almost perfectly against a quiet series of changes Renee had been making to my prescription regimen over that same 18 months. Changes I'd never actually discussed with Dr. Aldous myself, because Renee had positioned herself as the primary point of contact managing the refill requests and pharmacy communications on my behalf. I have to ask you something, because I think it sits at the heart of a story like this one. Have you ever handed someone your trust so completely, in an area you didn't feel equipped to manage yourself, that you stopped noticing when the story they were telling you about your own life started to diverge from what was actually happening inside it? That's the particular danger of delegating something as intimate as your own medical care. You don't just hand over paperwork, you hand over the narrative. That Thursday at the pharmacy started like any other monthly refill run. I'd been picking up my medications from the same small independent pharmacy for 11 years, long enough that most of the staff knew me by name. The regular pharmacist, a warm, sharp woman named Carol who'd always taken the time to actually explain my prescriptions rather than just hand them over, but was out that week. In her place was a younger pharmacy technician I didn't recognize, filling in from a sister location. She handed me my white paper bag with the usual efficient courtesy. Then, as I turned to go, she reached out and grabbed my wrist, not aggressively, but with a startling firmness, and leaned in close enough that I could tell she didn't want anyone else in the store to hear what she was about to say. "Sir," she said, glancing quickly toward the pharmacy's back counter, where an older pharmacist I didn't recognize was working. "The new capsule they added last month, the small blue one. Please don't take it tonight." She released my wrist just as quickly as she'd grabbed it, straightened her posture, and called the next customer forward as though the entire exchange had never happened. I sat in my truck in the pharmacy parking lot for a long while afterward, the white bag on the passenger seat, my mind turning over what had just happened. I didn't recognize her. I had no idea why a stranger would risk an awkward, unprofessional moment to warn me about a medication I'd been taking, as far as I understood it, on my own doctor's orders. But something in the specific urgency of her voice, not vague concern, a direct, pointed instruction, settled into my chest and stayed there. I did not take the blue capsule that night. The following morning, for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, I woke up without the familiar fog that had settled over my mornings for the past year and a half. My head felt clear in a way that, looking back, I realized I'd simply stopped expecting to feel at all. The way you stop noticing a persistent low hum in a house until it suddenly cuts off, and the silence itself startles you. I skipped the blue capsule again that evening. And again the next morning, I woke clear-headed, steady on my feet in a way that made me genuinely emotional standing in my own kitchen. Because I hadn't realized, until the fog lifted, just how much of it had become my new and quietly accepted normal. I want to be honest about what I did next, because I think the caution of it matters. I didn't immediately confront Renee. I didn't call Dr. Aldous demanding answers. I've spent enough decades teaching young people the scientific method to know that a single data point, feeling better after skipping one pill for 2 days, isn't proof of anything on its own. I needed to understand, calmly and carefully, exactly what that blue capsule was, who had prescribed it, and why. I drove to a different pharmacy across town, one where nobody knew me, and asked the pharmacist on duty, a patient older man, to simply look up the capsule based on the imprint code, without telling him anything about my situation. He turned it over in his hand, read the small numbers stamped into the shell, and typed them into his system. What he told me made the floor of my kitchen feel, in memory, considerably less steady than it had felt that clear morning. The capsule wasn't a blood pressure medication, and it wasn't anything Dr. Aldous had ever prescribed for my heart. It was a low-dose sedative, commonly used short-term for acute anxiety, entirely inappropriate as a daily long-term prescription for a man my age with my cardiac history, and specifically flagged, the pharmacist told me gently, for causing exactly the kind of cognitive fog and physical unsteadiness I'd been quietly living inside for the better part of a year and a half. I didn't call Renee that day, or the day after. I want to explain why, because I think it matters as much as anything else in this story. If I'd confronted her immediately, in the raw shock of what I'd just learned, it would have become an argument about my own confusion, easily reframed, if she chose to reframe it, as the very cognitive decline she and Dr. Aldous had spent 18 months quietly documenting. I needed the actual paper trail, undeniable and complete, before I said a single word to anyone in my family about what I suspected. So I did something quiet instead. I called Dr. Aldous's office directly and requested my own complete medical records. Every visit note, every prescription authorization, every pharmacy communication from the past 2 years. A request I was fully entitled to make as the patient, regardless of who'd been handling my paperwork in the meantime. It took the office 9 days to compile everything, which gave me time to think clearly about what I might find, rather than reacting the moment it arrived. When the thick manila envelope finally came, I sat at my kitchen table with my reading glasses and a cup of coffee that went cold before I finished reading, and I went through it the way I used to grade physics exams, line by line, checking every number against what I actually remembered happening. I want to walk through what I found, because the shape of it surprised even me, and I'd already braced myself for something troubling. The sedative prescription had first appeared in my chart 14 months earlier, authorized through a phone consultation that Dr. Aldous's notes described as being initiated by patient's designated care coordinator, with my own verbal consent documented secondhand, relayed through that same coordinator rather than obtained directly from me. I had no memory of authorizing that medication. I had no memory of a conversation about anxiety, a condition I'd never once been diagnosed with or complained about to Dr. Aldous in 11 years of visits. More troubling, buried further in the records, were a series of dosage increases over the following year, each one authorized the same way, through a phone call from the designated care coordinator. Never a direct conversation between Dr. Aldous and me. Each increase lined up, almost exactly, with a corresponding entry in his notes, describing worsening cognitive symptoms, symptoms that had never actually been raised by me, but had been reported to him, according to his own documentation, by Renee, during appointments where I was technically present, but where, I now remembered with an uncomfortable clarity, she had done most of the talking while I sat quietly, trusting her account of a life I was apparently living without fully realizing it. And then, on the final page, I found what actually stopped my breath. A referral letter, drafted 3 weeks earlier and sitting, unsigned, in a pending folder. A formal recommendation from Dr. Aldous for a cognitive capacity evaluation, the specific kind of assessment that serves as the first legal step toward a guardianship or conservatorship petition. The referral cited, as its justification, 18 months of documented cognitive decline and physical instability. Decline that, I now understood with a cold, sick certainty, had been manufactured one quiet prescription at a time. I didn't want this to become a war, not at first. I want to be honest about that because I think it's easy, in a story like this, to skip straight to righteous anger without sitting in the genuine confusion that comes before it. I didn't understand yet why Renee would do this. I still loved my son. I still, even then, wanted to believe there was some explanation that didn't end with the answer I was afraid of. I called an old friend, Marion Castellano, a retired pharmacist who'd run the independent drugstore in town for 30 years before selling it and retiring. Someone I'd known since our kids were in grade school together. I told her everything, the pharmacy warning, the sedative, the pattern of dosage increases, the unsigned referral letter. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me a question that reframed the entire situation for me. "Frank," she said, "do you want me to help you understand what happened medically? Or do you want me to help you understand what happened financially?" I didn't understand the question at first. She explained, patiently, what her decades in pharmacy had taught her about how home health billing actually works. Medicare and private insurance reimburse home health agencies at significantly higher rates for patients classified as having complex needs, cognitive impairment, physical instability, multiple comorbidities requiring frequent skilled visits, than for patients considered stable and largely independent. A patient documented as cognitively declining and physically unsteady, requiring increased monitoring and care coordination, generates a very different, very lucrative billing profile than a healthy 73-year-old managing his own affairs. Marion offered to help me pull my own insurance claims history. Again, something I was fully entitled to request as the policyholder. What came back? over the following 2 weeks was the second half of a picture I'd only been seeing one side of. I want to walk through this slowly, because the mechanics of it, once I understood them, were more calculated than anything I'd imagined sitting in my kitchen that first troubled afternoon. Over the previous 14 months, my insurance had been billed for a series of home health visits, skilled nursing check-ins, medication management sessions, cognitive monitoring appointments, conducted, according to the billing codes, by aides and nurses employed through the very agency Renee worked for as office manager. Dozens of these visits, spread across 14 months, totaling just over $11,000 in reimbursed claims. I had no memory of most of these visits happening. Not a hazy, foggy uncertainty, a clear, specific absence, because I'd spent the better part of that year largely at home, alone, managing my own daily routine the way I always had, without a parade of nurses and aides passing through my house on the schedule the billing records described. Marion, drawing on decades of watching insurance fraud cases pass through small-town gossip and occasional legal proceedings involving other pharmacies, explained gently what she suspected, that Renee's position as office manager gave her direct access to both my patient authorization and the agency's billing system, and that a cognitively impaired, physically unstable patient profile wasn't just a justification for eventually pursuing guardianship. It was the exact clinical picture needed to justify a sustained pattern of billed visits that may never have actually occurred, or occurred far less frequently and thoroughly than the paperwork claimed. The sedative, in this light, wasn't simply a controlling mechanism aimed at eventually easing me into a guardianship arrangement. It was maintenance, a way of keeping the underlying medical narrative consistent enough, month after month, that nobody reviewing the chart, least of all me, would have any reason to question why a stable, largely healthy retired teacher required this much documented ongoing care. I didn't confront Renee directly, not yet. I want to explain why, because I think the patience of this part mattered enormously to how everything eventually resolved. I understood by this point that I was looking at something that had crossed from a painful family betrayal into what Marion gently but clearly told me constituted healthcare fraud. A federal matter, not simply a private family dispute I could resolve over an uncomfortable dinner conversation. If I confronted Renee directly and she realized the scheme had been discovered, I had no way of knowing whether the agency's records, the actual proof of what had and hadn't happened during those billed visits, might quietly disappear before anyone official ever had a chance to review them. So instead, I did something quiet and specific. I contacted my insurance company's fraud investigation unit directly, as the policyholder, and reported a pattern of billed services I had no memory of receiving, along with a prescription history I believed had been authorized without my direct, informed consent. I didn't accuse anyone by name in that initial report. I simply laid out the facts as I understood them and asked for a formal review. The insurance company's fraud unit, I learned, works methodically and quietly, precisely because premature disclosure can allow a suspected scheme to destroy evidence before an investigation can properly document it. They asked me, gently but firmly, to continue behaving entirely normally around my family in the coming weeks, not confronting anyone, not raising suspicions, while they conducted a preliminary review of the billing patterns against the home health agency's internal records, cross-referenced with my own pharmacy and physician documentation. I want to walk through those weeks carefully, because the quiet of them mattered as much as anything dramatic that came later. I kept skipping the sedative, quietly, without announcing it to anyone. I continued my regular routine, Sunday dinners with Danny and Renee, occasional calls checking in, the ordinary rhythm of a family that, on the surface, looked entirely unchanged. It was, I want to be honest, one of the hardest performances I've ever had to give. Sitting across a dinner table from my daughter-in-law, making pleasant conversation, while somewhere in the back of my mind, an insurance investigator was quietly building a case against her. About 3 weeks in, the investigator assigned to my case, a careful, precise woman named Patricia Nunez, called to update me on the preliminary findings. She confirmed what Marion and I had begun to suspect, cross-referencing the billed home health visits against the agency's own internal staff, Scheduling logs showed significant, repeated gaps. Visits billed to my insurance on dates when, according to the agency's own scheduling system, no aide or nurse had actually been assigned to my address. In several cases, the billing codes matched visits, supposedly conducted by nurses who, according to separate employment records, had already left the agency months before the dates in question. Patricia also confirmed something I hadn't fully considered. Renee wasn't the only name connected to the billing irregularities. A small handful of other elderly patients managed through the same agency, all with Renee listed as the administrative contact coordinating their care, showed similar patterns: sedative or anti-anxiety prescriptions appearing without clear direct physician consultation, followed by escalating documented care needs and correspondingly inflated billing histories. I sat with that information for a long time after the call ended. I hadn't just uncovered something happening to me. I'd uncovered a pattern. I asked my son to meet me for coffee alone, without Renee, at a diner outside town we hadn't visited together in years. I told him everything, as plainly and carefully as I could. The pharmacy warning, the sedative, the medical records, the billing history, the pattern across other elderly patients. I watched his face move through disbelief, then confusion, then something that looked, painfully, like a slow and reluctant recognition. He told me, haltingly, that he'd noticed things over the past year that he'd never let himself examine too closely. Renee's growing irritability whenever he asked detailed questions about my care arrangements, a home office at their house he'd been gently but firmly discouraged from entering. Evenings where she stayed late, catching up on paperwork in a way that, now that he was actually saying it out loud, struck him as strange for an office manager job that had never previously required that kind of overtime. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "did I do this? By trusting her with everything, did I let this happen to you?" I told him the truth, the same truth I'd been turning over in my own mind for weeks. He hadn't done this. Trusting a spouse to help manage a complicated situation isn't a mistake. It's what families are supposed to be able to do for each other. The mistake, if there was one to assign, belonged entirely to the person who'd chosen to turn that trust into an opportunity. I told him I needed him to understand that distinction clearly, not just for my sake, but for his own, because I could already see him reaching for a guilt that wasn't his to carry. 2 weeks after that conversation, Patricia Nunez called again, her voice carrying the particular measured weight of someone about to deliver findings that had moved from suspicion into something closer to certainty. The formal investigation, now expanded beyond my individual case at the insurance company's direction, had identified a documented pattern across 7 elderly patients connected to the same home health agency, all administratively managed by Renee, totaling just over $94,000 in insurance claims for home health visits that internal scheduling records could not substantiate as having actually occurred. In several cases, sedative or anti-anxiety prescriptions had been authorized through phone consultations initiated by Renee as the designated care coordinator, without documented direct patient consent, closely followed by escalating billed care needs. The case, Patricia explained, was being formally referred to the state's healthcare fraud unit, a joint operation between the insurance industry and law enforcement specifically built to investigate exactly this kind of scheme. Renee would very likely face both civil liability to recover the fraudulent claims and potential criminal charges, depending on how the state's investigation ultimately characterized the pattern. I asked Patricia the question I'd been sitting with since that first troubling phone call weeks earlier. What would happen to my own prescription history? To the referral letter recommending a cognitive capacity evaluation? She told me, plainly, that once the pattern of unauthorized prescription changes was formally documented as part of a fraud investigation, any resulting cognitive impairment findings tied to those medications would be considered clinically unreliable, effectively voiding the basis for the referral entirely, since the decline it was built on had been chemically manufactured rather than naturally occurring. Danny and I told Renee together, on a Tuesday evening, in the same house I'd raised him in, the same kitchen table, where she'd once sat across from me, discussing my recent episodes, with a doctor who trusted her account over my own quiet confusion. I want to be honest about how that conversation went, because it wasn't the dramatic confrontation you might expect from a story like this one. Renee didn't scream, didn't deny everything outright the way I'd half expected. She sat very still for a long moment after I laid out what I knew, her hands folded on the table, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. She told us the fraud had started small, almost accidentally, a handful of billing errors in her first year managing patient accounts that she'd initially meant to correct, then didn't, then found herself quietly expanding because the agency's own performance targets had been squeezing her department for 2 years running, and the extra revenue, however she generated it, had kept her looking successful in a job where the alternative was watching her own position get eliminated. She admitted, with what sounded like genuine, devastated shame, that once she'd started down that path with other patients, extending the same pattern to me had felt, in the moment, like simply managing an existing system rather than crossing some new and terrible line specifically against her own family. I don't offer that explanation to excuse what she did. $11,000 of my own fraudulent care, and the physical and cognitive toll of over a year of unnecessary sedation, isn't something a difficult job justifies. But I want to be honest, that the picture that emerged wasn't a cartoonish villain twirling a mustache over a stolen inheritance. It was something sadder and more common than that. A person who'd made one small, wrong choice under pressure, and then kept making it, expanding it, until the person on the other end of the decision was her own father-in-law. And by then, the momentum of the lie had become easier to maintain than the terror of confessing it. The state healthcare fraud unit's investigation concluded 4 months later. Renee was charged with insurance fraud and unauthorized prescription authorization, ultimately reaching a plea agreement that included full restitution of the fraudulent claims, a permanent bar from working in any healthcare administration role, and a suspended sentence contingent on several years of supervised probation. She avoided the harsher outcome the initial charges could have carried, in part, I believe, because of how fully and immediately she cooperated once the investigation formally began, and in part because the other affected families, myself included, ultimately supported a resolution focused on restitution and accountability rather than maximum punishment. Danny and Renee separated about 5 months after that Tuesday evening at my kitchen table. I want to be careful here, because I don't think it's entirely my place to characterize the end of their marriage in detail. Some of it belongs to them, not to this story. What I can say is that trust, once broken this specifically and this deeply, rarely survives fully intact, even when the people involved genuinely want it to. My own medical records were formally corrected over the following months, the sedative prescription noted and flagged, the cognitive capacity referral withdrawn entirely once the fraud investigation's findings were shared with Dr. Aldis. I switched primary care providers not long after, not out of anger at Dr. Aldis specifically, who I believe was genuinely deceived rather than complicit, but because I needed, for my own peace of mind, a completely fresh start with someone who'd only ever known the actual, clear-headed version of me. I want to be honest about something, sitting here now, a little over a year removed from that afternoon at the pharmacy counter. I don't think I'll ever fully understand the specific moment Renee crossed from cutting corners at work into deliberately sedating her own father-in-law to sustain a fraud. I've stopped needing to understand it completely in order to have made my peace with what happened. What I've learned more than anything is how easily an aging person's own account of their life can be quietly overwritten by someone they trust to help manage it, not through a single dramatic act, but through a slow accumulation of small authorizations, small phone calls made on your behalf, small symptoms reported to a doctor who never quite hears your own voice, describing your own experience. I let that happen for 18 months, not out of foolishness, but out of the entirely reasonable trust you extend to family when you're tired. And the paperwork is exhausting and someone offers to make it easier. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this story, it's this. However much you trust the people managing your care, your prescriptions, your medical narrative, insist on staying inside that story yourself. Ask your own doctor your own questions. Request your own records, periodically, even when nothing seems wrong. The version of your health that ends up in your chart isn't automatically the truth. simply because someone you love was the one writing it down. There's one more thing I want to tell you, because without it, none of the rest of this would have happened. About 6 months after the investigation concluded, I went back to that same pharmacy, the one across town, hoping to find the young technician who'd grabbed my wrist that Thursday afternoon and quietly changed the entire direction of my life. Carol, the regular pharmacist, was back behind the counter, and when I asked about the woman who'd been filling in that week, she told me her name was Priya, a technician who normally worked at a sister location and had covered a single shift that particular week. Carol gave me the sister location's address. I drove over that same afternoon, walked in, and found her behind the counter, exactly where Carol had said she'd be. I asked if she remembered me. She looked uncertain for a moment, then her face changed as the memory surfaced. I asked her, gently, why she'd taken the risk that day, grabbing a stranger's wrist, whispering a warning she had no professional obligation to give, over a medication that, on paper, had been authorized through all the proper channels. She told me she'd noticed, filling in that week, an unusual pattern in the pharmacy's dispensing records. Several elderly patients, all connected through the same home health agency's referrals, receiving sedative prescriptions that seemed clinically inconsistent with their documented conditions. She'd mentioned her concern to the pharmacist on duty that day, who'd dismissed it as outside their scope to question a physician's authorization. She hadn't been able to let it go. When I came to the counter that afternoon, she said, something about the specific combination of my age, my prescription history, and an instinct she couldn't fully explain had pushed her to say something, even though she knew it wasn't strictly her place to. I almost didn't, she told me. I told myself it wasn't my business. Then I thought about my own grandfather, and I just couldn't let you walk out of here without saying anything. I want to end this story with her, rather than with Renee, because I think it matters. For every quiet betrayal built slowly enough to hide inside official paperwork, there's usually also a quiet act of courage available to interrupt it. A stranger willing to risk an awkward moment, a friend willing to make a difficult phone call, an insurance investigator willing to follow a pattern all the way to its uncomfortable conclusion. I didn't save myself alone. A young woman I'd never met, filling in for a single shift, decided that a stranger's well-being was worth a moment of professional risk. I think about that more than almost anything else from this entire ordeal, and I suspect I always will. If this story hit home for you, you're not alone, and there are more like it every week. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments, have you ever had someone else's account of your own life quietly become the version everyone believed? I read every single one,